Hello and welcome to this webinar. Sorry for the slight delay. This is the first webinar in our winter series. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Morag Williamson. I'm convener of Yes We You. We're a non-aligned grassroots group campaigning for Scottish independence and EU membership for Scotland. So we're delighted that Professor Stephen Gittins has agreed to speak for us tonight. We know he's very much in favour of both our aims. So the original plan was that we would have Stephen and Joanna Cherry speaking tonight, but unfortunately Joanna couldn't make it. So we decided to make this a webinar in two halves, and this is part one tonight with Stephen, and we'll hold part two in January with Joanna. So just a little bit about Yes We You. As well as online events like this, we do a lot of regular street campaigning, mostly around Edinburgh with street stalls and so on, and often collaborating with other Yes groups. Please consider becoming a supporter of Yes We You if you're not already. It's easy to find us online, on our website and social media. And our next stall happens to be this Sunday outside Stockbridge Market, 11 till 1. So I'm going to hand over to Leslie now, who's going to chair it. So many thanks go to her and the other team members, Sam, David and Elise. You'll see a bit of us from time to time. Thanks to the rest of the team for organising the event. So over to you, Leslie.
Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome Stephen, and thanks for coming along tonight. I know that you've just been in Brussels, so you've got a lot of interesting things to talk to us about. So I'm just going to start by giving a short introduction to Stephen, and I'm going to tell you that he was educated at Perth Academy and graduated with a Bachelor with Law at the University of Dundee, and he specialised in public international law. Before entering Parliament, Stephen worked in the NGO sector in democratisation and peace building in the Western Balkans and the South Caucasus. He was also a special advisor to Scotland's First Minister on EU and international affairs, as well as energy and climate change. In February 2015, Stephen was selected by local party members to contest the 2015 general election in North East Fife constituency. This was when I first started to actively campaign for the SNP, as it was clear Stephen was a serious, intelligent person and politics for all the right reasons. He won that seat and then retained it in 2017 by the narrowest of majorities. During his time in Parliament, Stephen served as an SNP spokesperson on the Foreign Affairs and Europe Committee twice, and he was the first member of the SNP to do so. He was at the heart of parliamentary debates before and after the EU referendum and sponsored cross-party motions and legislation. Although he increased his share of the vote, he lost his seat in 2019, and that was probably because I moved out of the constituency, and was subsequently appointed as a Professor of Practice in International Relations at St Andrews University. He's a regular contributor to the written and TV media and has recently written a book called Nation to Nation, which explores what Scotland's foreign policy footprint is and how it can provide the foundations for a foreign ministry in a newly independent Scotland. So now I'll hand over to Stephen to let him tell us what he has been doing.
Appreciate it. My name's Stephen Gittins. I'm Professor of Practice at the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews. I was formerly the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesperson at Westminster, sat in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and was the spokesperson on Europe pre-Brexit and on Brexit post-Brexit. And I used to work in the European institutions, as well as working in the international NGO sector as well, before I was an MP and went into academia. As a result of lockdown last year, and I'm going to talk to you a wee bit about this, I've written this book, Nation to Nation, which Nation to Nation, Scotland's place in the world, that basically has a look at Scotland's international affairs footprint, how we fit into the world, how we might fit into the world in the future, all of which I think is really of interest to the discussions that we're having tonight. I'm only going to talk to you maybe for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'd love to open it up to questions a wee bit. But I want to first of all talk about the history of Scotland's international engagement and why it has such a big impact on our domestic policy, why it's a big impact and has done for centuries on our day-to-day lives, and perhaps today it has a bigger impact than ever before. Pre-union, and I'm not a historian, but I think the background to these things is really informative to tell us where we are today. hundreds of years ago, when William Wallace re-established Scotland's independence in 1297 and became Guardian of Scotland, he, just after the Battle of Stirling Bridge, he wrote one of his first letters. And we know it's one of his first letters because Andrew de Murray also signed it, who died a short time after that battle. It's called the Letter of Lubeck. And basically what we know from even 1297 was one of the first things that William Wallace did when Scotland re-established its independence was he wrote the Letter of Lubeck, the only letter that we have in his name, that was basically a letter to the Hanseatic League, the EU of its day, saying Scotland's independent again, and therefore we are reopened for business, we're open for business once again with our Hanseatic League partners. That was 800 years ago. It's quite something, isn't it, that the lessons from that time are so pertinent today. Scotland sits as an important European power with relationships with the papacy, with other European powers until the Treaty of Union, caused in part by the Darien scheme, the Darien disaster, the attempt to set up a Scottish colony in what is now Panama, leading to bankruptcy and failure of that particular project. So in essence, a foreign policy project that led then to, that had quite dramatic after effects in terms of the signing of the Treaty of Union. Then throughout our history, after that, Scots play a role, an active role in part of the British Empire. We've got a diaspora that runs throughout the world. We continue to engage to a lesser extent with our European partners, although in places like Vera in Poland, in France and elsewhere, that becomes less and less. But let me speed right the way to recent times and what we are interested. So we're here to talk about the European Union. Scotland joins the European Union. In my opinion, that changes once again Scotland's relationship with the rest of Europe, of course, but also changes its relationship within these islands. I mean, there are people in Ireland, for instance, even though Ireland was independent, who say that it was only after joining the EU that it became truly sovereign and independent, given the role that the EU has to play. In recent years, we saw the Conservative government, so pre-devolution, the Conservative government sought to have a specific Scottish influence there. So the opening of Scotland House in 1992. And when I was writing my book, Philip Rycroft, former civil servant in the Scotland office and was the most senior civil servant in the Department for Leaving the EU, said that promoting that Scottish brand, engaging in Scottish interests in the EU was a government tactic. So all this talk that you get nowadays that the Scottish government should not be engaging in foreign policy, it's actually just a continuation of something that started under the Conservative Party, continued under Labour and the Liberal Democrats when you had an extension at Scotland House in Brussels, you had the opening of offices in Washington, DC and Beijing, and a whole range of other offices throughout the world. You have the SNP coming to power in 2007, and for the first time, you see a distinctive foreign policy being pursued at Holyrood than the one that's being pursued at Westminster, with a distinctive approach to the European Union as well. And then you have the Independence Referendum, of course, in 2014, when Scotland seeks to join the EU as a full member state. And what would have been in those set of circumstances, what's called internal enlargement. So the EU doesn't get any bigger in terms of geographical or population size, but gets bigger in terms of state size, because what was the UK becomes Scotland and the rest of the UK. That's all ancient history, but I think it's interesting to look at where we were in terms of where we're going in the future. Before I talk about the EU again, and that's where I'll finish off, because I think that's pertinent for us tonight, let me just talk briefly about Scotland's foreign policy footprint beyond the European Union, just for a moment, because I think it gives us a more rounded approach. In the book, I've looked at where does Scotland sit in the world, how might we see ourselves in the world, and that goes on geographical and policy terms that are quite distinctive from the UK. Scotland's not a mini UK. Scotland isn't Ireland. It's not a Nordic state. It's Scotland. But we can draw on examples and lessons from each of those. My geography teacher used to say to me, I went to Perth Academy, and I remember my geography teacher would say, you know, there's no right way up to look at a globe. And that's really interesting, because if you look at a globe the other way around, you see that Scotland's got, yes, really important relationships with England and Wales and Ireland, but but also across the Netherlands and Belgium, but also close relationships with Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Faroe Islands. And that's had an impact on our history, and throughout history, as well as having common citizenship with our neighbours in England and Ireland and Wales, as we do just now, we've also historically had common citizenship with the Norwegians, Danes, the French, for example, and a great deal of rights in places like Flanders, Netherlands, Germany. So these relationships have ebbed and flowed throughout our history. Even if, and I know for those of us on this call, I want to deal with sub-state actors, because until you're independent, you're a sub-state actor. This idea of engaging with the rest of the world is not just something that should concern those of us who believe in independence. I think this is an important rounded picture. You get other sub-state actors who invest quite heavily in international engagement. So the Flemish engage internationally, and if you're the Flemish representative, you have just as much diplomatic recognition as the Belgian representative. You also have direct representation within the EU and the EU Council of Ministers, where the Flemish and the Walloons and the Bruxellois will take a seat. The Faroese and Greenlandic have a quality of status in terms of diplomatic ties with their Danish counterparts, and the Danes make sure they do. And you even get the Greenlanders signing up to defence deals, the Faroese taking very distinctive approaches to foreign policy. And the same goes elsewhere in places like Bavaria, Quebec, and elsewhere, who invest actually a lot more heavily in their external affairs and international engagement than we do in Scotland. Why do they do that? Well, they do that because it's good for trade, because you can build relations, it's good for your culture. And the world outside has a big impact on your own domestic politics. So you see that this engagement internationally is not something that's just restricted to Scotland. It's not a big nationalist plot that's sometimes pointed out as being. And it's really interesting to see that that's something that's growing. In Brussels, there are 300 offices of sub-state, non-independent states, all the way from, say, Scotland House, Bavaria, they're quite big, all the way down to small local authority offices, places, or even places like Gibraltar or Jersey or whatever, who have representative offices there. Now, finally, going back to the EU, and I had a really interesting trip to Brussels this week. Let me reflect a wee bit on that. I don't like the term IndyRef 2 when people talk about forward debates and discussions and looking forward to debate on a referendum in the future. I like the term IndyRef new. The reason is, this isn't a rerun of 2014. There have been quite dramatic changes in circumstances, new opportunities, new challenges, and a different set of arguments about why Scotland should become independent. So it's not a rerun by any means, and I'm not comfortable with saying it's a rerun. And we need to get ourselves into a mindset about what the new set of circumstances means for those of us making the case for yes, but in fairness to those who want to make the case for the union, they do as well. In 2016, the EU referendum and the UK's decision to leave the EU and the subsequent very hard Brexit that we saw in the aftermath of the 2019 general election will have profound and dramatic implications for everybody in these islands and for the rest of Europe for generations, whether we like it or not. And I don't like it very much, but it is what it is. What's it mean? It means that Scotland was taken out of the EU against its will, that 1 in 5, these are John Curtis's figures at the University of Strathclyde, 1 in 5 people who backed no in 2014 had shifted to yes without much of a shift the other way. It meant that the big changes that you see in terms of those between, or the big differences between those who support independence and those who don't, tend to be generational. So the latest polling on independence showed two-thirds of under 55s support independence, that you need to be well into your 60s before you're comfortably in a demographic that believes in the union. That means whole generations now do not identify with the state for which they carry a passport, and are particularly angry about Brexit, which takes away their rights and takes away their opportunities. I was, one of the first generations of politicians to be in Parliament during the Brexit process, which left the generations that come after me with fewer opportunities than I had. It should be the other way around. There should always be better opportunities, and you should be creating better opportunities for generations to come after you than you enjoyed. Yet with Brexit, we've seen the reverse. So what can we do? What does that mean? Firstly, from a European perspective, I think there's a sympathy with and an understanding of independence for Scotland that in some cases, not all, but in some cases maybe wasn't there before. I think the debate and discussion around independence is very different because we are outside the European Union. That's just a matter of fact now. So that changes the dynamic. We would have to rethink our relationship with the rest of the UK if England persists in not being in the single market, which is a bad economic decision, one we don't want, but that may be their decision. It's their decision to take. But it also means issues like we need to consider institution building. We need to think that if we are part of a third country is a non-EU country, what does that mean for our engagement? And my argument is, and it was good to see some of this in the budget today, an increased spending on our international engagement and perhaps a bulked up presence at Scotland House, which has done a great job, won a lot of praise, but a bulked up presence at Scotland House. And I make some arguments in the book about how you might be able to do that, drawing on comments from friends and colleagues who are working in the European institutions. But fundamentally is this: the question about Scotland's relationship with the world, with Scotland's relationship with the rest of Europe, now goes to the very heart of the independence debate and our question about where we go next as a country. And for me, we've become the more mainstream option in a way. So you have the choice. There is no status quo anymore. You have the choice between Brexit Britain, which is very much a unilateralist project, compared to the multilateralism of rejoining the EU. And when people look for examples, there is only one example of leaving the EU, a state leaving the EU, it's the UK. And it's dipping economically. We're losing our rights and young people are losing out as well. So if you compare that and that isolationism to rejoining the mainstream, if you like, the duller option in many ways, but one that reasserts those rights, gives opportunities for young people and actually grow your economy. The Irish economy has now got the biggest levels of growth anywhere in the European Union. That's great for Ireland, but they don't like it. We'd rather see everybody in these islands have the benefits of membership of the EU, but Scotland needs to join as a member state in its own right, and the hard work needs to start now. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'll pass over now to Morag and David, who are going to take questions for Stephen. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie, and thank you very much for that introduction, Stephen. So first question, one of the ones we've had in advance, is what is the process of being internationally recognised as an independent state? How does it work? Does Nicola telephone the United Nations and ask to join?
So this is where things, I mean, the process would be that you provide that individual states recognise other states. So you get a certificate of recognition, I believe. I remember going through this when I was sitting on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. So there are challenges. So for example, Kosovo is recognised by a number of countries, the UK amongst them. Spain doesn't recognise Kosovo. And the reason Spain doesn't recognise Kosovo is because Belgrade doesn't recognise Kosovo. So the first question most people ask, even in Europe, will be, what's London's reaction to what's going on in Scotland? So that important bilateral relationship will continue to be important. And I think that's why the Edinburgh agreement between David Cameron and Alex Salmond that was signed from memory in 2011 was such an important part, because at that point, both sides agreed that they would recognise the outcome. And I think a lot of people, if London recognises Scottish independence, nobody's realistically going to interfere with that. And that's why how we go about the process of independence, how we go about the process of debating and discussing it is actually really important, because it's not as if people will wake up to Scotland the morning after an independence referendum and say, oh, right, oh, that's fine, come on in. People are watching now. They're watching the way in which we conduct ourselves now. They're watching the Scottish government, how it conducts itself now. So even though we're not yet a full international actor, We are a player on the international stage, and that means that's great in terms of opportunities for talking about the country and talking up the country, but also as obligations and responsibilities on us to conduct our discussion and debate in a way that is meritorious in terms of our international engagement as well.
Okay.
Thanks very much for that, Stephen. Can I come in with another question then?
Please.
So this is another one that we've had in advance, which is as follows. Once we have won the second independence referendum, not if, but when, will we need another referendum on whether Scotland should join the EU?
So in my opinion, no, and I'll tell you why. We had a referendum on whether or not we should be in the EU, and people in Scotland voted pretty overwhelmingly. I mean, 62% was the highest in the UK, but at that time, even though support in other member states has now gone shooting up as a direct consequence of the disaster of Brexit, that if you'd, let's say, you'd had that kind of vote in Germany, Angela Merkel would have, bitten your hand off for 62%. That was a fairly good endorsement on what is a challenging issue. So we've had that referendum. And I think that what you need to do if you're going for independence is that you give people as much certainty about the kind of you can't give them entire certainty. Things change, things in politics change every single day. But you can provide them with, what's your vision look like? Well, our vision is we want to have an independent Scotland as a member state of the European Union in the same way that our friends and neighbours are member states of the European Union, except for one neighbour who unfortunately decided to leave. Now, that's my view. That's the SNP's view. But Morag, you talked earlier on about the benefits of your own movement being a cross-party, non-party movement. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry, I thought we had another moment there. So the benefits of independence, you get the governments you vote for. So if you get an SNP government, you're a member of the EU, but there is nothing to stop people in Scotland voting for a party who might want to have a referendum on whether or not we're members of the EU. And if people in Scotland vote for that, and then they vote to leave the EU, and I sincerely hope they never would, and I don't think they would, then the power lies with the state. It does not lie with the European Union. It doesn't lie with your neighbours. It lies with you. So my ambition would be, and the SNP's, as I will be, that we remain members of the EU. But the great thing about democracy is you cannot tie the hands of your successors to make decisions based on the collective will of the people you represent. Does that help answer the question, Morag?
Yes, it does. Thanks. And I'm just wondering whether to tack on another question that's been put in here in the Q&A, which is related to it. So if you don't mind, I'll just carry on with this one. It would be interesting to hear Stephen's take on the practical differences between EU and EFTA membership as future vehicles for membership and European relations by an English Scotland.
So that was fair enough. And I know that before the Scottish parliamentary elections, obviously the Green Party and the SNP are pro-EU membership, and as I understand it, I think the Alapa Party said that EFTA membership. I disagree with it. I disagree. I think it should be members of the EU. The main difference about membership of EFTA and the EU is in EFTA you don't get access to the political institutions that you do as full members of the European Union. Secondly, what's the big challenge? Well, if England sits outside the single market and the customs union, then that still leaves you with a challenge about cross-border engagement, which is something we need to think about. So I don't see I think being in EFTA is better than what we've got now as the UK. There's no question of that. But I don't see the benefit of EFTA membership over EU membership. So for me, if you're going to be in the EU, you're in the EU, and that means sending your MEPs to the European Parliament. It means sitting in the Council of Ministers and having a full seat at that table. It means having your commissioner, and it means engagement in those European institutions. And what's interesting is you often hear Norwegian politicians, for example, a member of Norway, well, if they sit outside historical reasons, never joined, they often complain about having to be rule takers when it comes to the European Union, because they do not have a full seat at the table, but they have to keep up to scratch with most of the rules that come out of Brussels that are commonly agreed to by the member states.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think David's probably got another question now.
Sure. Well, let's take another one from the Q&A because they're starting to come thick and fast now. What would you say to the impatient indie supporters who seem to think that the SNP is not doing anything to prepare for independence, especially as regards building up relationships with EU countries?
Well, I'd say go and have a look at what the Scottish Government's doing. You know, I mean, look, when the Scottish Government and the Green Party signed their agreement, foreign policy was an integral part of that. So, you know, the opening up of new offices in Copenhagen and Warsaw was part of the agreement. Climate justice was part of the agreement. And you already see the Scottish Government engaging with the United Nations. You've already got an office in Brussels. Again, I think it should be upsized a bit to react to Brexit, but that takes a bit of time. So remember that the Scottish Government's got very limited resources in this regard. And I think they could be spending more money on this. But of course, if you spend more money on it, which I think is good value for money, you take away from other areas as well. So it's a question of balance. So it was good to see some increases in spending on it in the budget today. We'll see that increases in spending and budget turn into action. But I think the Scottish Government's doing well on this. And Nicola's engaged at the highest levels in the European Union, it's engaged at the highest levels in the United Nations and elsewhere. But remember that as far as we are not independent, you have to work that little bit harder at that. You are, unfortunately, a sub-state actor. So I think the Scottish Government are doing well. I think there's always things that you can do more of. I think, you know, everybody who wants independence now, want independence yesterday. And it's a question of trying to get there. I mean, anybody who thinks Nicola Sturgeon doesn't believe in independence is kidding themselves on. You know, she's been chapping doors since the party had 3 MPs, and it was a deeply unpopular thing to be in favour of. I remember those times in the 1990s. It wasn't a whole lot of fun. So government's hard. It's a question of balance. And the pandemic's also, you know, had a tremendous impact on it as well. So I think they're doing well. It's nice to see Angus in the position that he's in, and hopefully we'll start to see an increased engagement internationally, but building on the good work that's already happened, as was part of the SNP Green government deal.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yes, we were obviously in our organisation, yes, we were very, very pleased at the SNP and Green agreement earlier on, because obviously, you know, they were in agreement entirely with our own aims. So that was good. Now, can I ask you something a bit different, but this is actually a very common concern, and I'm going to put two similar questions together here. They are: can Scotland join the EU without having its own independent currency? And what do we do about the euro? As an obligation of membership, Scotland would have to make a good faith commitment to join the euro. However, sorry, this is quite a long one. Despite its pro-European sentiment, the euro is remarkably unpopular in Scotland. One opinion poll suggested that only 18% of people believe that an independent Scotland should take up the single currency. Committing to the euro would therefore be politically challenging.
So it's a really good question on the currency, really good question. So first of all, if you're independent, of course, I know I keep saying this, but I always think it's worth remembering, because sometimes when we debate politics, we debate as if you make a decision, say you decide not to go in the euro and you decide, right, that's it forever. Well, it's not it. I mean, politics evolves, people's views evolve, and that's something we should always be mindful of. That's so at the moment, I don't think Scotland would join the euro. It is unpopular. We don't have a currency of our own, but of course it would be SNP policy, and there are different policies in the Green Party and Alpha Party and other pro-independence parties about these issues, but it wouldn't be to join the euro. But you could not bind future governments on that. Sweden's not in the euro. Denmark's not in the euro. A whole raft of other countries are not in the euro. And interestingly, I was speaking to a former Danish cabinet minister for the book, who had been involved in European negotiations, and he said something really interesting to me, actually, and it's something I've heard before, which is if you're a sovereign state and you have political capital, all EU states negotiate with each other. You don't get everything you want. That's all. That's the reason why the EU can be a bit messy sometimes. You're trying to bring 27 independent sovereign states together, and that means that sometimes you get your own way. Sometimes you get sometimes you have to compromise. And I remember he said to me, look, if Scotland doesn't, if you want to join the EU, and remember Scotland be a net contributor with vast energy resources, having met the acquis communautaire, and also with a long external border. So we bring a lot to the European Union, so don't lose sight of that. And he said, look, if you guys want to join, but you want to be like Denmark or Sweden and not join the euro, then if that's your political ask, that's your political ask. And you need to think about that. But he did say this, and this is his perspective. He said, Denmark's not in the euro, and he said that's probably the best thing for our economy, but it does mean when big financial minister decisions are being made, we are not in the room. Now, that's a price that the Danes pay, and they're comfortable with paying it. But it's always worth remembering that there are ups and downs, there are, there are good elements and bad elements of all of these things. So I don't think we should join the euro. That doesn't bind governments in the future, of course. And then of course there are upsides and downsides to any decision that you might take around that.
That's very clear. Thank you. Okay, another one from the Q&A. Pre-Indie Ref New, all our foreign policy statements will be picked apart for anything that can be presented as a difficulty with Scotland, England, trade, citizenship, whatever, all based on worst possible case thinking of Westminster view. Does detailed thinking on post-Indie foreign policy risk damage to referendum campaign?
No. Tell you why. I think we've all got different views, but I think people deserve. You're asking, look, we're asking people to support independence. You're asking them to come with us on a bit of a journey. Now, I think that people deserve answers on where they think we're going to be. But remember, this is all about. It's all about what certain politicians say. So you can have independence and have different foreign policy. It's not as if you become independent and then all of a sudden you all agree with each other on foreign policy. No, I think we'll have a diverse parliament with different parties with diverse views. That is a normal, that is a perfectly normal state of affairs in any Western European democracy. I mean, look at places like Ireland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the diversity of views. However, in terms of where we sit in on foreign policy and that relationship, I think we should enter into independence in a spirit of generosity and look where we can help people elsewhere in the UK. I think it'll be good for the English and Welsh economy if Scotland's in the European Union. It's already good for the economy that Ireland's in the European Union. And just think there'll be another member of the European Union, just like Ireland, with close links to the rest of the UK, transport links, language links, legal links, commercial links, family links, educational links. That'll be good. That'll be good for them to have another friendly voice inside the European Union. But actually having that slightly disparate relationship between the constituent parts of these islands will not be unique. And actually one thing that I always refer to, and in the book I look at the northern North Sea area, the area that we're in. And you can tell it's northern North Sea if you look out your window tonight, right? So the weather might be grotty, but what you get is some political alignments or some political lessons. Now, if you look across the North Sea to the Nordic states, you have Finland in the EU and in the Euro, just like Ireland. You have Denmark and Sweden in the EU, but outside the Euro, as where I suspect Scotland would end up. You have Norway, Iceland outside the EU and the Euro, like where England and Wales are probably going to remain unless Wales changes its situation. And you know what, and then even at a sub-state level, at a lower level, you have the Faroe Islands and Greenland, which are part of Denmark, but sit outside the European Union in the same way that Jersey and the Isle of Man are technically part of the United Kingdom, but sat outside the European Union. And the Åland Islands, which actually had to vote separately to join the European Union along with Finland, and even has its own, and as part of that deal, maintained its duty-free. So if you sail from the Åland Islands to any other part of the EU, you get your duty-free, but you're still in the European Union, because that was a deal that the Ålanders did at that time. So what's interesting in that example is, first of all, there's a much better relationship between the constituent parts of the Scandinavia / Nordic entities, a partnership of equals. that people over there can feel their local identities, their national identities, be it Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, Danish, but also feel a Nordic sense of identity and partnership as well. And what's really striking is you see the much better relationship they have with each other post-independence for Norway and Finland, in the same way that Ireland, that became independent at about exactly the same time as Finland, probably now has a better relationship with the rest of the UK and with its big neighbour in England than it ever has done in its history. So I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the Nordics anyway, but I think how they rub along together in terms of their membership or non-membership of the EU is a really good example.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. I think the Nordic countries, we could really learn a lot from them. So I've actually got another question here sent in advance, sort of related to that previous one. Could you talk a bit about Independent Scotland's foreign aid operation? What would it look like? Which bits of the world should we target? How do we maximise the impact? Would we commit to the 0.7% target of GDP? So
Yeah.
sorry, that's a lot of questions in there.
No, it's not. It's a really good question. So I'll tell you why this is good. So the reason I wrote this book was, and I'm going to tell you, and this answers the question, but I should have said this in my preamble. The reason I wrote this book was there's somebody called Malcolm Chalmers, who's deputy director of RUSI, big Royal United Services Institute, big think tank down in London. And I interviewed Malcolm for the book. Malcolm's a unionist, pro-union. But he said to me, he gave me a really good interview, and he said something, tell you what, Stephen, he actually said, when the independence referendum comes along, I'll be campaigning for a no vote. I feel my British identity. I want to remain part of the UK. But if you're right and people vote for your proposal, then I hope it's a success, and I hope that's, and he said, and if you want it to be a success, then you can't wait for independence to set out to the world what your values are, what your policies are, where you sit in the world. That's a discussion you need to be having right now. And that goes for international aid. So yes, I think we'd sit at 0.7%, but a discussion in terms of our values and where we sit in the world is, if you look at other countries of 5.5 million, similar economies, so our neighbours, what they recognise is you can't do everything. You need to work in partnership. So the European Union becomes important, the UN and other international organizations become really important. And you've got to figure out where you're going to specialize subject-wise and geographically. So I think that's a discussion that we need to be having right now. What we're good at, I think we're being ahead of the curve on climate and climate diplomacy, climate justice, the loss and damage fund, for example. I think we're pretty good on things like arbitration and acting as a hub in terms of a safe space for areas affected by conflict. And I think that on issues like military medicine, higher education and research, we're pretty good on that as well. Now, that's great to talk about all the things that you're good at and where you should focus. But what that necessarily means is you need to have a discussion about where you're not so good at and where you don't need to focus, because so that's a conversation that I think is evolving. So I think we subject specialize, we fit into the rest of the European Union. I remember from a few years ago, for example, different people do different things. The Danes are really good on refugee issues. The Norwegians are really good on conflict stabilization. The Finns were increasingly good on issues like governance. So where do you fit in and where do you work? So in the same way the United States is probably the sort of foremost economic military power in the world, as is China increasingly, the EU is a huge soft power entity. And so I think we have to channel enough. I'm not averse to being more integrated with a common foreign and security policy, but meeting your 0.7% and specialising as well. But again, that's not just me, that's a conversation for us all.
Very, very clear, thank you. Next one, I need to paraphrase slightly, but
oh, I think Leslie was wanting to.
Oh, sorry, Leslie. You're on mute, Leslie.
I can't stop myself from asking questions. There was a bit of a discussion in the chat, and it sort of stemmed from something you were talking about earlier, which is EEA and EFTA. And, you know, a lot of the conversations we've had are very kind of really interesting and very nice and whatever. But I think that what people are very worried about on the doorstep is the economy. What happens on day one, you know, if we leave the UK, well, are we going to lose everything? And the discussion that was at this, the meeting last night was about the EEA and EFTA versus full European membership. And what the person who was talking to us, who was from the SNP Policy and Development Committee, was suggesting that if we went the EEA or EFTA route, we could actually arrange that so that we would be in the markets on day one, so that if we left the UK, we could be in the single market. Whereas if we didn't do that and went for full EU membership, then it could be quite a number of years before, and we would be left without trade deals with anybody, with the UK or with anybody within Europe. And I just want, yeah, there was a bit of a discussion in the chat, so I wanted to get your ideas on that.
So just very quickly, is that, look, I think you could actually, I disagree with a number of people on this, and I think you can probably join the EU reasonably quickly, because what you can do is, first of all, you need we've met the acquis communautaire, and actually if you speak to people in Europe, they often differentiate between Western expansion and Eastern expansion. So for example, if Iceland or Norway were going to join, it would be a reasonably quick process. Serbia wants to join, which I think it should. I think the Western Balkans should. Longer process, but they've got bigger, more integral challenges around rule of law issues, that are, you know, democracy issues, representative issues that we don't have to the same extent. Now, one thing the EU is the EU is an intensely political animal. It finds solutions. If you look at how it dealt with East German expansion, 17 million East Germans joined the EU overnight, you know, breaking all the rules. Cyprus, whereby they put, and they were probably not strong enough on this actually, but you know, all the rules which were looking at Cypriot reunification, they also had a fudge because when Croatia joined, it had an outstanding border dispute with Slovenia, which you shouldn't really have before you join the EU. Now, Scotland's only about 5.5 million. It would be in the interest to stabilise that relationship as quickly as possible for everybody. I think you could probably have an association agreement, even if you were not able to negotiate entry immediately. I don't think it's impossible, if you've started to work now, sized up Brussels, making sure that your rules are as closely aligned to Brussels as you can possibly get. I don't think it's impossible to join the, you know, to have a two-track negotiation, which would be a secession negotiation from the UK and an accession negotiation with the EU. And let's say you go back to the old, you know, you take the 2 years, which was talked about before. I don't think that's impossible. It's been done previously. I'm not saying it's easy, but actually, or even could you have, let's say for argument's sake, you even have that 2-year period, and if the EU is a bit kind of like, oh, we're not quite there with a couple of institutions you need to build, so we're going to have a 1-year bridging year or something like that. I mean, I can remember when Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, even going back to the big enlargement in 2004, you were already seeing, before they joined, Romanian, Bulgarian, Croat officials. In fact, the Croats I knew particularly well, so I knew a lot of them from my time in the Western Balkans. The Croats were already being employed in the institutions. There were MEPs who were already turning up without voting rights, but as observer MEPs. So you already see the process of accession. It's not as if the shutters are down and then that's that until everything's agreed. You start to see it, you know. So at the end of its journey, I remember Croatia best because I was there. No, I was watching it. Is that you were already seeing Croats being employed. You already had a fairly good idea who the Croat commissioner was going to be. You had a fairly good idea who the MEPs were going to be. So these changes take place, you know, and the country the size of Scotland, it's a lot easier than, say, Turkey, for example, which is much, much bigger, which have much more of an impact. It's much more manageable. So these are political questions and they're usually political answers to them.
That's great. Thank you for that. Could we just check how we're doing on timing? We still have plenty of questions and some of them are quite good, but we did say this was going to be an hour. Can we just check with you, Stephen? Are you okay running on a bit?
Yeah, shall we run on a wee bit?
Okay, well, let's take two at the same time
Yep.
that are related. Scotland is independent and rejoining the EU. What is stopping the rest of UK from declaring a hard Skexit and throwing up hard borders between Scotland and England landmass? Would the EU accommodate this somewhat with a NI protocol equivalent? And very related, if we become independent and join the EU, how is trade between Scotland and rest of UK going to work? At present, if I in UK send goods, Xmas presents, for example, to Ireland, I'll end up paying customs duties and VAT. These practical issues are a pain.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Well, it depends on your partners, doesn't it? I mean, that's the problem. You cannot dictate your terms to those who are from elsewhere. My hope is that the rest of the UK will be sensible about it. Now, if the rest of the UK is not going to be sensible about this, then that will, of course, have implications for Scotland, but will also have implications south of the border as well. I think there was a study done, I'm not an economist, but I think there was a study done prior to the last independence referendum that something like 500,000 jobs in England require relying trade with Scotland. You know, trade goes both ways. And if you get a hard right government down in England that decides to throw up barriers with everybody, because it's already throwing up barriers with the EU, I think that, yes, it causes difficulties, but it actually underlines why you need independence more than ever before. Are you going to be held hostage because of a hard right government in England who are happy to see job losses amongst their own population in the name of politics? So yes, there are challenges. Yes, we need to start talking about this. Remember, the Scottish border is in many ways easier than the Northern Irish border because there are fewer crossing points, shorter border, more long-standing border. But bluntly, I think that that independence and Scotland rejoining the EU may be the shock to the system that is needed south of the border. If you think about it, the OBR forecasts showed a 2% hit to the economy as a result of COVID. Nobody could have foreseen that. Nobody, you know, and you can criticize reactions to it, but it's not really anybody's fault. That's happening to everybody, and you will recover. Everybody will recover from that. 2% hit from COVID, 4% hit from the EU is doubly bad. That is a political decision. There is no recovery from that because it's a long-term solution. That does hit the poorest and most vulnerable in society. And I often hear about people who are pro-union talking about solidarity. Why should we be worried about people in Glasgow and not people in Liverpool? Well, I do care about people in Liverpool and about our neighbours, but this is about a partnership of equals. I don't want to see people in Newcastle or Liverpool being any poorer as a direct result of bad decisions being made at Westminster any more than I'd like to see, you know, people I studied with in Belgium becoming poorer as a direct consequence of decisions that are made in Brussels in terms of the Belgian capital, or in Ireland because of Dublin. You know, I mean, I think European solidarity is something which has developed. We saw that with the vaccine. And I think that, I honestly think that Scottish independence will be a really good thing for people across these islands. I mean, I know I speak to my family down in Kent quite regularly about this and how this is something that is good, and it's about resetting the relationship in these islands. And I think what Brexit's shown is that's something that's long overdue.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. And that notion of European solidarity, I think it feels quite painful for a lot of us that we're shut out of that at the moment. So that's really quite motivating, because that's something that we really admire and want to be part of again. So I've got another question for you now, which has been put in the Q&A. And Marlene is asking, talking about how the world is watching us now, what do you think about how we did during COP26?
I think we did pretty well, all things considered. So I know the First Minister took criticism, but let's take a step back about talking about Scotland for a moment, right? Let's say any country in the world hosts COP. So you get your one moment when the whole of the world turns up to talk about the most important issue in the world, bar none, and you're hosting. Now, the main focus on that was United Nations and the high-level agreements and all the stuff that, you know, matters more than anything else, right? Climate change matters more than anything else. The First Minister did the right thing. She spent every day there. She made world-leading announcements, and she tried, you know, because you should, to put a bit of a sales pitch for Glasgow and a bit of a sales pitch for Scotland as a whole. You have to make the most of these. And I noticed that, you know, through meetings with the Secretary General, with the Chancellor, with the President, all these global, as well as Indigenous groups, campaigning groups, other sub-state actors as well. She worked pretty hard. And I have to say, I think people should expect that of any leader of their country. You know, I mean, if you lift COP as happens every year, and let's say when it happens anywhere else in the world, what do world lead, you know, when it was in Madrid a couple of years ago, then of course the mayor of Madrid should have spent a lot of time, because the world was in Madrid, showing off Madrid or showing off that part of Spain. And I think sometimes the First Minister took criticism. I think that's because people disagreed with her on the constitutional question or politics. I'd have expected, if there was a Labour or a Conservative First Minister, I'd have expected them to have showed off Scotland, because that's their job. And I think she did well. And she was knackered afterwards, but I think we had a huge opportunity and we took the opportunity, and it was good to see.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's just do, right. You were awake on a Friday in May 2023, the morning after a vote by the Scottish people for independence. As either foreign minister designate, or at the very least an advisor to the minister, what are the first 3 calls that Scotland's foreign minister needs to make? And what are the talking points in those calls?
Belter of a question. I've had this question before. First call, I'd say 1, 2, and 3 is to London to say, you've gained a good neighbour. We're here, we're your friends, we're your neighbours, and we're looking forward to building a positive relationship with you. That's your first call. Your second call is to the European Commission or the European President, whichever is most appropriate. It would be a joint call, Commission, the President, so Charles Michel and von der Leyen tend to go in for the joint calls. So it's Michel and von der Leyen saying, right, okay, we're getting on a plane to Brussels to open up negotiations, and the other, you know, and somebody else is getting on a plane to London to open up those negotiations. We'll see you soon, you know. And what are the calls? So in London, it's about good neighbourliness. It's about, we want to be a friend, want to make this as smooth as possible for our old friends, old allies, and our closest bilateral relationship in the rest of the UK. Then for our closest multilateral relationship in the European Union, it is, we want to have accession as quickly as possible. We want to be a bridge between London and Brussels. We want to help you rebuild that important relationship with this large and important island off the coast. And your third phone call, that's a difficult one, because actually they're your 2 big priorities. I suspect it would be to the Taoiseach over the President of the United States, actually, to the Taoiseach to say, you know, can you help us? And also, can we maybe reassure people in Northern Ireland that this will have no impact on them, and we're here to be a good neighbour to you and your closest ally in Europe, but we're also here to assure people in Northern Ireland about the impact that this might have on them. But it's a difficult one to say, you know, but I think off the cuff, London, far and away, Brussels, possibly Dublin.
I think you would be looking forward to those phone calls, Stephen.
Yeah, I think it'd be amongst the better phone calls you could make. And look, you have to remember the way people deal with in international affairs. Remember, and this is really important, that people, the way they treat you before a referendum and after a referendum are 2 entirely different things. You know, so the whole idea of having an independence referendum is that decisions made about Scotland are made by people who live in Scotland, not by people who live in Germany or elsewhere. And I think what you'd see would be, if you get it right in terms of your relationship in London. I remember reading somewhere the UN would probably recognise you quite quickly. Other capitals would recognise you quite quickly. You'd open up accession negotiations with the EU. But again, this is why how we conduct ourselves on the run-up to any referendum will have a direct impact on what happens on that morning of May 2023.
That's what we like to hear. So I think we should close now.
Okay.
Thank you ever so much for staying on a bit longer, Stephen.
Pleasure.
We've got through loads of questions. Thanks ever so much, and thanks to participants for sending these questions in. They were great questions, really varied. So Leslie, was there anything else that we needed to say just now, other than thank you and thanks very much?
Just thank you to everybody who's attended, and thank you to Stephen for coming along. And
Yeah.
it's been really useful, and I like the fact that we can tell people that we can join the EU quicker, because we had Kirsty Hughes here who suggested that it might be, quite a long process. So, I don't think that takes into account the politics, like you say, which is a really interesting point.
Yeah, Kirsty's got some really good points, which is worth listening to. And I always think we should listen to people when they've got things to say that we don't like to hear, because that's part of this process of independence, and listening to the difficult things as well. I respectfully disagree with Kirsty, but I do not disregard her views on this. They're worth listening to.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting.
No problem, and we see you again, maybe on the street somewhere soon.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you,
So nice to
Thank
see you.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.